All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know how it is you want to get smart on the stuff that matters, but you don't want to feel like you're drowning in information?
Yeah, totally. It's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes, right?
Exactly. And today we're tackling something that's at the core of how we process all that info, how we actually think.
We're talking critical analytic thinking, or CCAT for short form.
Oh, ooh, CET. I like it. Catchy.
Right. Burns and Dunbar did this really cool research paper on it, and honestly, it's eye-opening. It's like this fundamental skill we need, this toolkit for navigating all the information overload we face every single day.
Think about it, news headlines, what people are saying online, presentations at work, even just casual conversations. We're constantly taking in claims, trying to figure out if they hold water or not.
It's everywhere, and that's exactly what we're diving into today. What is CCAT? How does it develop? And why should you, dear listener, care about it?
Because this isn't just some abstract theory. It has real-world implications for how we make decisions, big and small.
Totally. And what's fascinating is that this idea of a CA, it draws from so many different fields: education, psychology, philosophy, social studies, even science and politics. They all touch on it in some way.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. What exactly does critical analytic thinking do? Like, what's its role in all this information exchange we do as humans?
Well, think about it this way. How much of what you know actually comes directly from your own experiences? Probably not that much, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I know comes from what I've read, watched, been told, and so on.
Exactly. So much of our knowledge comes from others, which means it all boils down to how we deal with claims and arguments. That book you read, that documentary you watched, advice from a friend, someone is making a claim, presenting something as true.
And those claims are literally everywhere.
Absolutely. And every single one of them, at its core, has a truth value. It's either accurate or not, and it's supposedly based on some kind of evidence.
Okay, but sometimes that evidence isn't that clear, right? It can be misleading or just plain wrong.
Exactly. And that's the crux of it. If we blindly accept every claim we come across without thinking critically, without applying that CAT filter, well, that can lead to some serious consequences.
No kidding. Like, remember that time I take medical advice from a random YouTube comment? That was not my finest moment.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Yeah.
The paper actually gives some really good examples. Bad medical advice is one thing, but think about flawed intelligence leading to bad policies, or public opinion being swayed by misinformation. It's even more important when we talk about huge, complex issues like climate change. Are we looking at the data critically, or just accepting what fits our pre-existing views?
Right. So it's not enough to just have evidence. We also need to evaluate its quality. How do we know if it's actually good evidence? What are some common pitfalls in how claims are made?
Well, there are a bunch of ways things can go wrong. First off, there's our own bias. We all come to the table with our own experiences and beliefs, and that can totally color how we see information.
So we need to be aware of our own filters, right?
Absolutely. Then there's straight-up deception, sadly. Some folks might intentionally mislead you. But even without bad intentions, evidence can be incomplete, unclear, or open to multiple interpretations. And the data collection itself could be flawed, right?
So garbage in, garbage out.
Pretty much. The paper gives the examples of climate change and nuclear power, showing how political leanings can affect how people interpret the scientific data.
Right, those hot button issues where things get really messy. So we've got the evidence, which is tricky enough, but then there's the logic that connects it all, the argument itself.
Exactly. And being able to recognize a flawed argument, that's the second crucial part of T. The paper talks about deductive reasoning, where if the initial statements are true, the conclusion must also be true. Like if all humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, then you're human. No two ways about it.
Ah, the classic logic puzzles. But real life isn't always so neat and tidy, is it?
Nope. We've also got probabilistic reasoning. This is more about likelihood and probability. Like noticing patterns. If all the swans I've seen are white, I might assume all swans are white. Or figuring out the most likely explanation, kind of like a detective piecing together clues. Or drawing comparisons, like analyzing the Russia-Ukraine situation through the lens of what happened with Iraq and Kuwait.
Okay, so deductive is airtight, guaranteed conclusion if the premises are true, and probabilistic is more like making educated guesses, weighing the possibilities.
Precisely. And it's with those educated guesses that we can sometimes fall into those logical traps. The paper talks about some common ones like the slippery slope argument. Like if we ban this one type of ammunition, the next thing you know, they'll be confiscating all our guns.
Yeah, that escalating chain of events that doesn't necessarily follow.
Right, that jump in logic. Then there are non sequiturs, where the conclusion has nothing to do with the premise. The example about brain lateralization and how that should inform teaching methods. That's a classic non sequitur. And then there's just a general tendency to take things at face value, especially from the media, without really questioning them.
So it's like CT is our mental shield against bad information. It helps us avoid being tricked by weak arguments and flimsy evidence.
Love that analogy. It's all about being epistemically vigilant, which is a fancy way of saying be on the lookout for things that might be trying to mislead you. Some researchers even argue that our whole capacity for reasoning, from an evolutionary perspective, is tied to this need to evaluate claims, to make communication more reliable.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The paper points out that even when we're faced with evidence, we often don't change our minds. Like, we tend to ignore alternative explanations and just cling to our existing beliefs.
It's so true. There was this brain scan study showing that our prior beliefs can actually block us from even processing contradictory information. It's wild. Our biases can be that deeply ingrained.
Which is why SAC isn't just about analyzing other people's claims, right? It's also about being honest with ourselves.
100%.
Mm.
If we can spot those logical fallacies and shaky evidence in others, we got to turn that same critical eye inward, recognize our own potential for bias. And this is huge in fields like healthcare. The American Nursing Association, for example, really emphasizes SAC in their training because if you're misinterpreting symptoms or test results, well, that could have dire consequences.
Right, the stakes are high. And research has shown that medical teams who are better at SAC actually make more accurate diagnoses. So this isn't just an academic exercise. It can literally save lives.
Powerful stuff, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked about what SAC does and why it matters. Now, the paper gets into this idea of critical analytic thinking as category, or CATC.
CATC, okay. What's the deal with that? Why is it useful to think about SAC in this way?
It's kind of like, think about how we understand complex categories like animals or sports. There's no one single defining feature that makes something a sport, right?
Yeah, it's more like a bunch of characteristics. Running and jumping are common, but then you've got things like competitive eating, which some consider a sport.
Exactly. So instead of trying to come up with this rigid definition of SICAT, a checklist of must-haves, it's more helpful to think about it as having these characteristic features. The more features present, the stronger the example of SICAT.
So it's not black and white, yes or no. It's a spectrum. And SICA can show up in different ways to different degrees.
Exactly. And the paper outlines 7 key characteristics. First, SICAT is metacognitive and reflective. You're thinking about thinking, both your own and others. You're going beyond just understanding the argument itself. You're examining the thinking process behind it.
Okay, makes sense.
Then it's evaluative. You're judging the quality of the evidence, the soundness of the reasoning, not just accepting claims on blind faith. This is where you, the listener, need to actively be assessing how strong that evidence actually is.
All right, I got to put on those critical thinking goggles.
Exactly. Third, it's skeptical and moderately distrusting, recognizing that people make mistakes, they have biases, they might have ulterior motives. So approach those claims with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Don't just believe everything you read on the internet, kids.
Wise words. Fourth, it's analytic. You break things down. You scrutinize the elements of the argument, how the evidence was gathered, how it was evaluated. It's like dissecting an argument to understand its inner workings.
Gotcha.
Fifth, CSAT strives to be unbiased and open-minded. Now, this one's tricky because we all have our biases, but it's about actively trying to set those aside, being aware of your own assumptions, being willing to consider alternative perspectives.
It's like that saying, strong opinions, loosely held.
I like that. Sixth, it's effortful, time-consuming, and mentally taxing. This kind of thinking, it takes energy. It's not always easy or quick. And it might require you to dig a little deeper, do some more research.
Not always the most fun in the moment, but definitely worth it in the long run.
Totally. And finally, number 7, CAT requires sufficient domain-specific expertise. This means you need some background knowledge in the area you're thinking about to really evaluate the evidence and methods used. Like, you can't really critique a scientific study on quantum physics if you don't know anything about quantum physics.
Right, you need some foundation to build upon. You can still be skeptical and open-minded, but that deeper analysis needs a bit more. Okay, so we've got these 7 characteristics of CTC. Now, the paper also talks about this idea that our thinking can vary from situation to situation. Like, how come we don't always bring our A game when it comes to reasoning?
Yeah, this is where things get really fascinating. We used to assume that humans were inherently rational, but research has shown that, well, we make a lot of irrational choices.
Speaking for myself, definitely guilty as charged.
Same here. Daniel Kahneman's work really revolutionized this field. The idea that we often rely on intuition, on mental shortcuts, rather than careful deliberation, is powerful.
Right, that gut feeling often takes over.
Exactly. And more recently, these dual process theories have emerged, suggesting we have two systems of thinking, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, intuitive, unconscious, and that's usually our default mode. System 2 is the slower, more reflective, more logical one that requires conscious effort. And CAT, definitely a System 2 process. But how exactly these two systems interact is still debated.
So is that why someone can be super logical and analytical at work, but then make totally emotional decisions in their personal life?
That's one explanation, and it seems like something needs to trigger that shift from System 1 to System 2. The paper gives the example of how we're more critical of studies that go against our beliefs than those that confirm what we already think. We're more motivated to put on our critical thinking hats when our existing views are challenged.
Oh yeah, I totally do that. If it fits my narrative, I'm like, yep, sounds legit.
We all do. But the paper also talks about how some people just seem to have a natural tendency towards CCAT, almost like a personality trait.
Like they're just wired to be more skeptical and analytical.
That's what researchers like Keith Stanovich are exploring, this idea of a disposition towards SKEEK, a habit of mind that makes them more likely to engage in it, regardless of whether the information aligns with their biases or not.
Yeah.
There are even ways to measure this tendency. But then others argue that SEEK is more domain-specific. Like, maybe you're great at critical thinking about history, but terrible at it when it comes to finances, for example.
So it might not be this general ability that applies across the board.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, to really understand what SEEP is, it's helpful to look at what it's not. And the paper goes through a few comparisons here.
Absolutely. Defining by contrast can be really useful. So first up, C is not the same as just being intelligent, though some have argued that they're closely linked.
Right, because you can be super smart and still fall for misinformation.
Exactly. They did research on different teaching methods for intelligence versus critical thinking, and it showed that they're distinct. Plus, studies haven't found a strong correlation between IQ scores and measures of CHE.
Okay, so intelligence isn't a guarantee of critical thinking. What about the connection between CHE and being good at problem solving?
That's a tricky one. Some researchers, like Daniel Willingham, equate the two, and they definitely overlap, right? Ideally, you'd use CHE when trying to solve a problem, but the paper argues that CHE is actually broader than just problem solving. Like, you use it when you're evaluating a news report or analyzing an argument, even if you're not actively trying to solve a specific problem.
So it's a tool that can help with problem solving, but it's not limited to just that.
Right, it's about evaluating information, arguments, claims, regardless of whether there's a problem to solve.
The paper also mentions this idea that CHE is just about making logical deductions and inductions, which isn't quite right either, is it?
Yeah, some define it really narrowly like that, focusing just on the logic part, but it's much richer than that. It's about the skepticism, the domain knowledge, the open-mindedness, the ability to evaluate evidence and methods. And remember, we're not always perfectly logical creatures. Our beliefs can get in the way of even sound deductive reasoning.
Right. Those pesky biases can mess things up, even when we know the rules of logic.
Exactly. And to add another layer, the paper dives into how problem solving has been traditionally understood. You know, that idea of navigating a problem space using various strategies.
Okay, how does that relate to seats?
Well, the paper points out that those classic problem-solving models often don't consider the ethical, emotional, or social aspects of the problem. And that rich framework, how we analyze and strategize through problem spaces, isn't always applied when people talk about CT.
So seats is relevant to problem solving, but brings in these additional dimensions.
Precisely. And finally, there's the question of scientific thinking. Some people use the terms interchangeably, but the paper argues that they're not quite the same.
Yeah, because you can do science without necessarily thinking critically about every step, right?
Exactly. And you can apply CTA to non-scientific fields too, like history or ethics. However, if you want to get at the truth, whether you're a scientist conducting an experiment or a historian investigating an event, CET is your best bet. And that domain-specific knowledge thing comes up again. Like, a historian might not be the best person to critique a complex physics experiment. Plus, we still don't know if teaching research methods in one field actually improves critical thinking in unrelated areas.
So CET can really boost scientific thinking, but it's this versatile tool you can apply across all sorts of inquiry.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've tackled what CT is and what it's not. Now let's get into development. How does this ability develop in kids? When do we see those first glimmers of critical thinking? And how often do we actually use CAT as we get older?
These are the million-dollar questions. And to even start answering them, we need a clear operational definition of CT that we can measure across different ages. So the paper, drawing on that CTCK idea, lays out some key questions for researchers.
Like, what are they looking for when they study CX development?
So many things. Like, when can kids start thinking about their own thinking? When do they grasp that evidence can be interpreted in different ways? When can they differentiate between a logically guaranteed conclusion and one that's just probable? When do they understand the link between theories and the evidence that supports them? When can they spot good versus bad methodologies? When does that skepticism kick in, that ability to recognize bias, and even more importantly, to mitigate their own bias? And more generally, when do we start seeing that system two thinking emerge? And it's not just about if they can do these things, but how often they actually apply these skills in everyday life, all the way from childhood to adulthood.
So it's about capacity and frequency. Okay, we've got the research questions. What does the research actually say?
Well, we can't go into every detail here, but the paper sketches out a general developmental trajectory. So there's this old idea from Piaget that abstract thinking really takes off around age 12. But more recent research shows that even much younger kids, like 3-year-olds, can do some surprisingly abstract thinking.
Wow, 3-year-olds.
I know, right? And the development of our memory systems plays a role too, because CJET requires us to hold and work with information, but it's not a straightforward relationship.
Okay, what about those metacognitive skills? Thinking about thinking and understanding what others are thinking. How did those develop?
Right, those are key. So young kids do develop a basic understanding of other people's minds pretty early on, which helps them learn language. But recognizing faulty thinking or multiple interpretations, that takes longer.
It's more nuanced.
Exactly. And studies on preschoolers show that by age 3, they can consider if a source has been reliable or not in the past when evaluating a claim. But understanding more subtle reasons for doubt or someone's underlying intentions, that seems to come later, around 6 or 7.
So even little kids have a sense of where information is coming from and whether to trust it.
They do.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole thing about perspective taking, which is crucial for avoiding bias. Studies on moral development have shown that even 3-year-olds can recognize when someone is being unfair, suggesting they can consider other people's points of view.
Interesting.
What's also super important is that context and framing can really affect how C is demonstrated at any age. Like, you might see adults reason like children when they're dealing with a topic they know nothing about. And conversely, kids who are experts in something can reason like little adults.
It's not just about age, it's about knowledge and how things are presented.
Totally. So we've talked about the early years. What about teenagers and adults? What's going on with CCAT development there?
Fill us in.
Research on how our understanding of knowledge changes as we age suggests that we go through stages. Young kids tend to be absolutists, black and white, right and wrong answers. Then, teenagers and many adults move into a multiplist stage where they recognize different perspectives but might think all opinions are equally valid. And finally, there's this evaluative stage where you can respect different viewpoints while still using criteria to judge which ones are better supported by evidence and logic.
That's the ideal, right? Being able to weigh different perspectives and not just say, well, everyone's entitled to their opinion.
Precisely. But here's the kicker. Even in highly educated adults, that multiplist stage, that all opinions are equal thinking, is super common.
Wow, I wouldn't have guessed that. You'd think more education would automatically lead to better critical thinking. What about those biases we talked about earlier? How do they play into all this?
Yeah, the biases are a huge factor. Studies show that teens and adults have strong tendencies towards things like confirmation bias, only seeking out info that confirms what we already think, or the sunk cost fallacy, where we stick with a bad decision just because we've already invested so much time or money into it.
Ugh, I'm so bad with that. I've totally held on to clothes I never wear just because I spent money on them.
We've all been there. But here's a fascinating tidbit. Some research actually suggests that young kids might be less susceptible to certain biases, maybe because they haven't formed such rigid beliefs yet. But even scientists who are trained to be objective fall prey to confirmation bias. So it's something we have to constantly be aware of.
It's like a lifelong battle against our own brains. But the paper does mention that we can improve our reasoning skills, right? It's not all doom and gloom.
Definitely not. Research has shown that engaging in group discussions and debates can help teenagers and adults reason better. And there are techniques that can help us activate that system two thinking, that slower, more deliberate mode. But even with these interventions, we only see about a 50% success rate. So clearly, there's room for improvement.
50%? That's not great, is it?
It highlights how complex this is. And it leads us to the big question: why do we see these developmental trends with CACT? Why does it seem to be such a struggle for so many people, even adults? The paper offers a few possible explanations.
Okay, let's unpack those. What's the first idea?
The first one is kind of a bummer, but it's probably true the way we're typically taught doesn't exactly foster critical thinking. Teachers and textbooks often present information as these set-in-stone facts without really getting into the nitty-gritty of how we know those things. They don't always explore the evidence, the methodology, the debates within the field, or how ideas have evolved over time.
Yeah, if you're just spoon-fed information, you don't learn to ask those critical questions or evaluate the answers yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The paper also points out that we rarely do activities that actually mimic how professionals work in different fields. School is often very structured, with a clear path to the right answer.
Right, like those perfectly planned science experiments where you know exactly what's supposed to happen.
Exactly. So there's not a lot of room for those aha moments, for dealing with unexpected findings, or for grappling with uncertainty. And then you get to college, and suddenly you're expected to engage critically with complex ideas, consider multiple perspectives, and deal with ambiguity. It's no wonder some students struggle. This aligns with the idea that learning to think in a fundamentally different way takes time and repeated exposure. And there's research showing a correlation between years of education and how well people express critical thinking in arguments.
Makes sense. Okay, so our education system might be inadvertently hindering C-attitude development. What's the second possible explanation for these age trends?
This one's about developmental constraints. The fact that our brains and our knowledge base develop over time. So the argument is that even if we try to teach critical thinking early on, there might be limits to how effective it can be, especially for younger kids. Because to really evaluate evidence in a field, you need some expertise, and that takes years to build. Can we realistically expect a 5-year-old to critically analyze a scientific study on, say, genetics?
Probably not. And the paper also talks about working memory, right?
Yeah, that's a big one. Our working memory, our ability to hold and manipulate information in our minds, gets better as we age. And it also improves with expertise. CNET, by its very nature, requires that extra mental capacity to juggle all those pieces of information, to weigh different arguments, to consider biases. So younger kids might simply not have the working memory bandwidth to fully engage in CTAT.
Interesting. So it's not just about having the knowledge, it's also about having the mental horsepower to actually process it all.
Exactly. And the paper addresses this seeming paradox of why preschoolers sometimes show surprisingly good skills, but then adults still struggle. They suggest that the familiarity of the content and the way tasks are scaffolded in those studies with young kids might be making it easier. It's an open question whether we could effectively teach IKCAT using familiar content in elementary school, even if those skills don't automatically generalize to new areas. It's a fascinating area of research.
So it's not just a linear progression where we get better at CKAT as we get older. There are all these other factors at play.
Totally. And the final explanation the paper offers has to do with motivation.
Okay, motivation.
Yeah.
How does that tie into critical thinking?
Well, think about it. CCAT takes effort. It's not always easy or fun to really scrutinize information and arguments, to question your own beliefs, to consider alternatives. And those dual process theories we talked about, they touch on how motivation plays a role in switching from that effortless System 1 thinking to more demanding System 2 thinking in older individuals. However, we don't have much research on how to motivate younger children to engage in System 2 thinking.
Interesting.
Kids are naturally argumentative, but it's not clear if that directly translates to CCAT as it's defined in the paper. So it's another big open question. Can we find ways to motivate younger kids, those under 10, to engage in deeper, more critical thinking? Can we make it more appealing or rewarding?
I mean, it's got to be more engaging than just memorizing facts from a textbook.
Right, so it seems like this confluence of factors, how we're taught, how our cognitive abilities develop, and our motivation to actually engage in the hard work of thinking, they all shape how and when we develop and use CTAT. Which brings us to the really practical question. What can we actually do to foster critical analytic thinking? How could we teach it more effectively?
Yeah, let's get to the actionable stuff.
The instructional implications really stem from what we've been discussing, how CIAT develops, and its evolutionary basis in communication and argumentation. And the first big takeaway is that classrooms, at least some of the time, should try to emulate professional work environments.
Okay, I like that, but what does that look like in practice?
The paper highlights a few key elements. Students posing their own answered questions, questions that require actual data collection, and then they need to engage in appropriate methodologies to get that data.
So not just like look up the answer on Wikipedia.
Exactly. And then there's the element of surprise, of encountering unexpected findings, and then the real magic happens, discussing and debating the interpretation of all that evidence, both the expected and the unexpected, as well as what's missing. And it's crucial that this happens in a collaborative setting where students are working together, identifying areas of uncertainty, and providing peer review on each other's work.
It's like a mini research lab right in the classroom.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And the second big approach the paper suggests is to use those detailed cognitive and sociocognitive models of CCAT to develop targeted interventions. Like how we've seen success in areas like language acquisition and executive function training. We need to get more specific than just general critical thinking exercises. We need to target the specific components of CCAT.
And the paper gives a couple of really neat examples of this kind of targeted approach in action, right?
Yes. One was a year-long study with 6th graders where they analyzed a pond ecosystem. They used jar models as an analogy for the pond, and the students themselves got to come up with questions, observe changes, and think about unintended consequences.
Okay, sounds cool.
Right. A big focus was on the limitations of the jar model, how it's not a perfect representation of the real pond. The activities were designed to get students to ask those good research questions, develop their own investigation systems, invent their own measures, construct convincing data representations, and then ultimately determine what conclusions were warranted, how much trust they should place in their findings.
So they weren't just learning about ponds, they were learning about how to do science.
Precisely. And a big part of it was peer review. They'd critique each other's research questions, methodologies, and the researchers gave examples where the students actually caught problematic aspects of their peers' designs that would make interpretation difficult.
Oh, I love that.
Right. Like in one case, the students realized that if they removed all the fish and frogs from a jar to examine them, they'd mess up the ecosystem and wouldn't be able to observe the interactions anymore. And the study found that this approach led to significant improvements in the students' understanding of the ecosystem, methodologies, and the nature of science. And they were able to integrate this with their regular curriculum and even standardized test prep.
Okay, so it wasn't just some extra thing tacked on, it was woven into their learning experience.
Exactly. And the other example was this study with 6th graders in a philosophy class, where they engaged in structured argumentation and debate.
Philosophy for 6th graders, I like it.
Right. They met twice a week for 50 minutes each time, over 4 13-week quarters. And each quarter had a new topic, like homeschooling, China's one-child policy, teacher pay, real-world issues. They had this whole debate cycle first. They'd prep as a team, all with the same stance on the issue, gathering evidence. Then they'd engage in online arguments with the opposing team. And finally, they'd have a whole class face-to-face debate.
So they got to experience the whole process, from research to debate to reflection.
Exactly. They had coaches who helped them formulate questions and provided those short answers, but the students themselves had to really think through the issue, anticipate what the opposing side would say, and consider the weaknesses in their own arguments.
Oh, I like that. Anticipating counter-arguments.
Right. And after each debate, they debrief using this argument map to detail the structure of the argument and the evidence presented. They even awarded points for effective arguments and credible evidence, with a winner declared at the end. And then after the debriefing, they'd write argumentative essays, which were scored on how well they integrated the different sides of the issue.
So it wasn't just about winning the debate, it was about understanding the nuances of the issue.
Exactly. And the results show that the students who did this philosophy class, they were able to generate more sophisticated arguments and wrote better essays than the control group, and these effects persisted over time.
That's amazing. So what are the key takeaways from both these studies?
What's striking is that both involve this really explicit scaffolding, breaking down the process of argumentation and evidence evaluation into manageable steps. And the tasks themselves were carefully designed, with a clear focus on constructing effective arguments and using strong evidence.
So it's not just about having a free-for-all discussion, there's a real structure to it.
Exactly. And it's important to note that both these studies were with kids older than 10. So how to best apply these approaches with younger kids is still an open question. Plus, it highlights the importance of consistency and time. We can't expect kids, or adults, to master CCAT overnight. It takes multiple attempts, sustained effort over time to really internalize those skills.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Well said. And then the paper briefly mentions that even when you present people with evidence that contradicts their beliefs, it doesn't always lead to a change of mind.
Yeah, we've all encountered those folks who are just not budging from their position, no matter what you say.
Right. And it suggests that for some entrenched concepts,
Mm.
it might not be enough to just present new information. We might need to help people actively inhibit those old ways of thinking.
So it's not just about adding new information, it's also about actively suppressing old, incorrect information.
Precisely. They give the example of how learning Newtonian physics often requires us to inhibit those intuitive but incorrect Aristotelian conceptions of motion. Like those old ways of thinking are so ingrained that we have to actively work to overcome them.
It's like a mental tug of war.
Totally. And ultimately, the paper concludes that we'll likely need to draw on multiple approaches, multiple theoretical frameworks to really effectively foster CNT. It's not.